Welcome to Noisecutter.
All right, and so for this first episode of the Noisecutter podcast, I'm actually joined by a friend and client of mine at Chatterjee Legal PC, a guy by the name of Teja Yanamandra. Teja and I have been friends since high school, and we've always kind of batted around, news headlines and, had the discussions that try to cut through the headline noise in a way that sort of gave rise to, the idea for this podcast in and of itself. In further episodes, we'll be connecting, more directly with the people reporting the news. But for this first one, here's two guys just kind of chopping it up. Let's go. Hey, what's up, everyone? My name is Rex Chatterjee, and with me is Teja Yanamandra, and this is the Noisecutter Podcast, Episode 1. Teja, say what's up.
What's up, y'all? This is Teja. We're excited to cut through the noise with you guys.
All right, so today is January 21st, 2023, and we'll go over, recent headlines and recent stories. We're trying not to be too blippy and cover things that are really just only relevant for, shock value for 5 minutes and then nothing. We're really trying to focus more on things that are going to be thematic and have a long-term and, potentially protracted impact on business and shape the future of it. So, the first thing, and this is interesting, especially because Teja, you're so involved in tech, the FAA meltdown, right? Basically, for those of y'all who kind of maybe missed this story, last week, because of a technology glitch in the systems of the Federal Aviation Administration, flights in the U.S. were grounded for, I think it wound up being hours.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, Teja, what's your take on that story and how did this happen?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, what's interesting is as we look at even what constitutes, let's say a salient headline or what actually makes the front page of any of, the major newspapers. It's usually something to do with either how technology has evolved or failed to evolve to meet, modern needs. And I mean, you get kind of what we have on the docket today. It's how law maybe hasn't been able to catch up, or in terms of legislation, it hasn't been able to catch up with how the economy is working today. So this piece was interesting because, or rather this event was interesting because if you listen to the FAA, what they're saying is, hey, we had a backup database that stored some information that got accidentally deleted. And so, And so apparently they were trying to reconcile some information. And this had to do with the system called NOTAM. And so NOTAM is the main database for basically communicating with different airlines. Mm-hmm. And basically how they were sending planes to and fro. And so, there's an interview that the chairman emeritus of Airbus did. Is it Airbus? I think it was Airbus. And he was basically they shut it down because some airlines had contingency plans to handle this breakdown and could still fly, and some airlines couldn't. And so it would create inequity basically in the airline market if they allowed some airlines to keep flying and some not to. And so, was it the right decision to ground all the flights? I don't know. That's, I guess, what they decided. But it's definitely interesting because ultimately it came down to a technology problem, which FAA says it was due to their contractors that they hired. And that's relevant to a previous conversation we had about, how much technology work is conducted by government contractors.
So first of all, it's very easy to just blame the contractor, right? Because the contractor isn't elected or tied to personnel and placed by the elected officials. So I always take kind of a side eye when the blame is always shifted to a, non-official, third party, let's say, right? So,
mm-hmm.
One of the big things here is and this gets talked about a lot in much larger contexts, is this need to reinvest in infrastructure. And people talk about crumbling bridges and highways and things like that, but so much of our ability to even use those things like bridges, highways, or airspace is incumbent upon technology infrastructure that exists like virtually, right? So,
Right.
and maybe not even virtually. We're talking about hardware. Like here, they point to certain points of hardware failure as well, and they basically say that this hardware is old, right? Um, this is the kind of problem also of building systems upon systems. And if you think about technology and the way it exists today, it's kind of like Jenga, right? But you're not like playing Jenga, like where you're taking bricks out. You're building the Jenga tower that you want to play on. And you're just stacking new bricks on top of old bricks. Like I remember, so I was working on the Living Will project, right, for a large bank that I was an employee of, and before that was a consultant of. Um, and we had to inventory all of the MIS or management information systems that were applicable to the bank's ordinary operations, such that if the bank were to fail or one of these systems were to fail, how would we stop the contagion from creating, a 2008 Lehman Bear Stearns type of scenario, right? And that's what the Living Will
Mm.
is designed to do. It's if you fall down by yourself and don't, knock down the businesses around you, et cetera. And one of the crazy things was like we had, there were databases, and not just at the bank that I worked at, but like at virtually all of the large banks that were working off of COBOL. And most people who consider themselves like, in the development space and technology or software nowadays might not even like, if they were born after like, I don't know, 2000, let's say, right? Or like 95 even, may not have ever heard of COBOL.
Totally.
Like it's been that outdated, right? And finding people who know how to code in it, first of all, or second of all, rather, is just a huge like issue. And that's just one example from my own experience. And I'm not sure if we're talking about systems that are that outdated with respect to the FAA, but as an overarching point, when you look at like things that happen today, like a plane takes off and it flies and it gets to its destination, part and parcel of that value stack is coded in a programming language that probably has been outdated since like the early 90s.
Right.
And we're still kind of reliant on that. And when you talk about building sustainable businesses for the future, um, I feel like that has to get accounted for somewhere.
Right. Yeah, totally. I mean, it's like airlines, their pre-flight process was reliant on NOTAM, which is like notice to air missions. I
Right.
think that's what it stands for. And
Yep.
yeah, I'm curious to know what it was built in, but because of that failing, I mean, a backup system for that failing, I mean, basically, you can think about how much economic loss was created in the span of a day. You know,
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be the product of like now, this is how governments work, right? Like a panel must be formed to investigate, and the investigation will take, 6 months, and then we'll get a report, etc. I'm reading reporting here from CNN that we'll link to in the show notes that the computer system that failed, NOTAM, was 30 years old and at least 6 years away from a plan to update. So this is
yeah,
also kind of the shocking and kind of crazy thing, right? And people are calling out Pete Buttigieg as like, oh, you're Secretary of Transportation, like what, this is your fault. What did you do? And it's like, dude, right? Like you can't imagine that like one figurehead leader is going to go inventory like thousands of different systems, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's teams of people that are doing this, but nevertheless, unless there was some kind of escalation of this, issue internally and we just don't know about it, how is it routine, business as usual that you have a system that is 30 years old and yet not scheduled for update until 6 years? Like, are we that resource poor? It's America. I kind of wish to not believe that, but maybe it's the truth. Um,
yeah,
like I just, given how frequently Microsoft updates my Windows, almost annoyingly so, right? Like I just don't see how 30 years ago and 6 years away, and we're okay with this. Oh, and it's critical to like planes flying, how that's acceptable. But I don't know. You have a much better and more informed position on these kinds of issues. Yeah.
you know, I mean, my instinct is that it's really hard to sell a project as a contractor that involves like cleaning up code or like making a system more resilient. it's just hard, right? Like you always want to sell new value, or you want to sell like some incrementally better feature that adds some new thing to something. And it's hard, I think, to sell like a total refactor of an existing system that has no quote unquote customer value. And so I think that there just hasn't been an economic incentive for firms to escalate this as like a thing that we want to do. And like also the purse strings don't get, it's like not politically popular. Like, hey, we're refactoring the NOTAM system. It's like, okay, how is that a $50 million line item or a $5 million line item? Like that's something that probably get scrutinized, right? So I think that's hard. But, I mean, it's funny because like at Instagram, they have a team, they have like a product and engineering team that's specifically focused on removing features from their application. So like they'll look at the features that aren't used, therefore have limited customer value, and they'll strip them. And like in turn, that makes the app a little bit more intuitive and also probably more robust because it's just not like getting a bunch of cruft in terms of, how the application logic works. And you imagine that was never done with this type of, or it's probably not done in any government funded software system. Right. And so I think it's a matter of incentives. I think it's a matter of like how like revenues flow into a government and like how ultimately they're spent. And like it's tough, I think, for a company to sell to a government to say, hey, we want to make this more streamlined. We want to make this more robust. It's hard to get the bureaucrats to
understand that.
untie the purse strings.
Yeah, no. And I mean, look, right. Like, and this is the problem inherent in sort of politics, right? And like, if you go back as an elected official to your constituency and say, hey, yeah, look, right, like that new football stadium that you guys wanted for, the local football team, the NFL team or whatever, we couldn't put together the federal funding that would be needed to like effectuate that deal. But we did make the, boring system you've never heard of, NOTAM, we made that way stronger and it's great now. People would have been like, well, NOTAM wasn't causing a problem, right?
100%.
Until NOTAM does cause a problem, and then everyone wants to stamp their feet and say, wow, what are you doing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It doesn't escalate to the point of being a problem until there is a problem like this.
Right. How do we shift? I mean, maybe this is a stupid question, right? But like, when will people learn that, like, do people do their oil changes, right? So at least there's some, like in the general populace, some kind of like understanding that, oh, I need to do this preventative maintenance. Otherwise, I'm going to have a real problem in the future. But with large government expenditure, it seems not to be the case.
Man, I think there's just like mean reversion in terms of like ownership mentality at really large organizations. I haven't been able to really unpack it. Like, I'm still like trying to figure out like how, if a company gets really big, how to maintain that culture of like, hey, we want to own problems. We never say that's not my job. And like, we're willing to put our necks on the line to get something done that's really important that maybe the leadership doesn't see as important. I don't know. It's like super challenging. It's really challenging. And it's also really challenging if like the bureaucrats in a government have no real electoral pressure, right? Like, because Buttigieg is an appointee, but the whole apparatus under him, they're like careerist bureaucrats. So like they kind of have to do the bare minimum to stay in their job. And like, okay, we'll swap the appointees every 4 years or 8 years, but my job's safe. And so I don't know, in a system like that, it's tough. Maybe put electoral pressure on the bureaucrats that then introduces like the risk of not having any tribal knowledge about where things are really buried. But I don't know. There has to be some market force.
Yeah,
I think in the underneath the executive, underneath the appointees, maybe this is the solution. If there's a way to put some market pressure, either through the electoral system or through like Singapore has like civil service tests,
right?
Where basically the best people get jobs in the government and they get paid a shitload of money,
right?
But it's really hard. Maybe that's a way to kind of get like that excellence,
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, in the government. I don't know.
That's the thing. It's like paying government workers lots of money. Now you're starting to get into a question of like, this is not what we do today, right? And I think if we do it, you'll get to a why not me sort of, like you're going to wind up being like at least a government that America has not seen before, where government workers earn like comparable to private sector.
Yeah, totally. I mean, but
like,
yeah, but like, you can imagine, like, at least if we imagine a world where like a really sharp kid who, I don't know, went to an Ivy League school is like, I can either go work at Goldman Sachs or I can go work for, I don't know, the Department of Transportation. Like that
yeah,
never happens today. That never, right? Like that's not a real choice.
right,
And like that's where our best and brightest minds are going, unfortunately.
yeah.
Right. So I don't know how you would get them to really consider working in the government under the executive branch in an administrative capacity as like a really interesting option. But I think it seems like that's part of the way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're not wrong.
Yeah.
So let's go on to the story regarding the JP Morgan acquisition of Frank. Did you look at that one?
No, that one's all you. That one's all
Okay.
you.
So, I mean, long story short, right? And there's a lot to say here. So, long story short, JP Morgan paid $175 million to acquire Frank, which was a fintech, to help college students fill out financial aid forms, right? Basically, it is a thing that helps students. It does good and, can generate value, right?
Yep.
Okay. So part of the diligence package, right, or part of the representations included that Frank had at the time of acquisition. I think it was something like 4.25 million users post acquisition, and Frank was founded by like a kid or a young person, I should say. Charlie Javis is the name of the founder and former CEO of Frank. And sold it to JPM for 175 mil, and then it came out upon further diligence post-acquisition, that's the key post-acquisition, that only 300,000 of the users were real and the remaining were fake.
Jesus.
And there's emails, right, that have come to light where this founder emailed a data science professor and was like, "Yo, can you generate for me like a large chunk of fake users with a pretty like deep and embedded history right behind them, right, so that this would pass like a surface level screen of whether these people are real or not, or whether these users are real or not." And like,
That's insane.
what? Like, why does this stuff keep happening?
It's crazy. I mean, I admire the cojones, but that's insane.
It's
That's
nuts. I mean, I don't admire the cojones. That's fucking ridiculous. Like, so here's the thing that I still really don't understand, right? Because like, look,
Charlie's a woman or a
Charlie's a woman, yeah.
fair.
Charlie
Yeah.
Javis is a woman. So if people wanted to really look at a company with like a user base, right? In preliminary due diligence, if you really had a suspicion and wanted to get to the bottom of were their users fake or not, there are ways to do this, right? And again, from the technology side, you probably have a better perspective on how that gets done than I do. But I'm at least aware of like several investigatory tools and methods that could be used to verify this stuff.
Yeah.
What I think happened here, and what I think happens, has happened in the past as well. And I'm thinking about, Theranos, I'm thinking about FTX. There is this fascination by investor communities, whether it's Silicon Valley, whether it's private equity, like whether it's venture caps, private equity, or whether it's companies, right? Bank and non-bank, right? So in this case, it was JPM, but could be even like I don't know, like a Cargill or somebody like that, right? Like large pools of capital buying companies. I'm not saying that there is an investment there that I'm thinking about, but I'm just trying to name like large companies. There's this fascination with the wonder kid, that there's some 20-something-year-old who's just like got this brilliant idea to like disrupt things and turn things on their head. And I mean, both of us, like from the legal side and from the actual development side, working in tech, we see this stuff all the time. And I don't know about you, but like I always look for the proof of concept, and I don't like I'm looking at the work and not the founder to be like, is this legit or not, right?
Yeah.
I don't know why people that are significantly richer than I am making investments can't seem to understand that. That's my big frustration, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are.
It's like so interesting, man. So many nights have been spent debating this between us and between, my friends who, work in the same industry.
Yeah.
I think it starts with, like, if you're an investor, if you're a professional investor, you're meeting hundreds of people a year,
Sure.
right? You're meeting hundreds of people a year. It's like dating at scale or something. And like
Mm-hmm.
you develop this model either through the investments that you've made that are successful or the investments that your peers have made that are successful, that, kind of like, because it's really hard to dig into a business and to do proper due diligence, right? But it's really easy to like index off of like somebody's personality and their demeanor and their confidence, let's say. And I think what happens, even to the best investors, is that they get into this sort of like investment psychology of like, hey, this guy or gal seems really cool, with it sharp, high energy,
Mm-hmm.
seems like they're a great person. I want to invest in their business. Because you're not looking at the business. You're actually like, I've heard this from a number of venture investors, like you're looking at how the person speaks about the business, but you're not really looking at the facts. You're like looking at like how they emote in some ways and like how they talk about the opportunity and how they talk about their team and how they talk about their friends. It's all like almost social signaling. And so I think once you get to the point at which like you're actually looking at the business, you've kind of already decided. Like you've already sort of decided that I need to make this investment. And like once you get there, the dynamics at any firm are like, hey, like I've represented to the partnership group that this is a good company. We all need to meet this person. And I think there's an incentive to kind of like, I mean, I don't know, but I bet that there are more companies that are invested in once they get to diligence than not. And that doesn't mean that all the companies should pass diligence. It just means that the funds have invested their time to get to this point. And their LPs expect them to generate returns.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
They're likely paying a yield to the LPs to keep this money.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have to make investments. And, it's like, could I meet another company as good as this or another founder? I don't know. So I think like that's the backdrop of like the incentive structure for those who manage large pools of capital. I mean, I don't know. I've never done it, but in talking to a couple of institutional folks for like our last round, that's sort of what I gathered. Like they want to deploy money and like they really want to deploy it. And you're kind of like, hey, like let's figure it out. But like a lot of funds are like, yeah, like we want to do business. And so I think that that's what's tripping them up. And I'm like, look, I mean, the $1 trillion companies of today are mostly started by people who are like in their late 20s or 30s when they
Mm-hmm.
start, right?
Mm-hmm.
Apple.
Say more. What do you mean? Yeah. Okay, right. No, but that was in a different generation, right? So like, how do I put it? The 70s and 80s were different, man.
So my parents keep telling me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and like I was, born. Well, we were both born in that decade. Neither of us were doing anything more than like eating baby food
That's
during that
true.
decade, right? But
That's
like those times in the business world that we were never in were different. Opportunity was like there was more of it.
yeah.
Look, and that's not to say. I mean, look, both decades did have their economic downturns and political crises, but like the idea that you can have a Jobs or a Gates or like even fast forward to the 90s, like it was 90s, right? That Bezos, right? But even then, I think it has to do with the lack of perfection of information or lack of like access to information, right? Like relatively speaking, like I think competition has become much more fierce
That's true.
as
Yeah.
time has gone on because people are much more informed
Yes.
and the awareness in the marketplace of who's doing what is much better, right?
Yes.
So like it's sort of it this goes back to like this idea of like the telescoping theory of technological evolution, right? Big breaks in the sciences happen with increasing frequency because there's a positive feedback mechanism at stake, right,
Yeah.
or at work. And so that is to say, you can have these big watershed and momentous breakthroughs And I think, from the 70s to the, 21st, second decade of the 21st century, or I guess we're in the third decade now, that timeline is not too small a sample to really look at how things have telescoped. The differences between the 70s and the 90s in terms of technology are less than the differences, I would say, between 2015 and 2023. Or 2008 and 2023, right? Like things are developing at a much faster rate. So like when you think about, there were dudes in garages starting what are now $1 trillion companies, right? Yeah, but you would expect in like the early, relatively early years of the semiconductor boom for that to be much more of a thing than nowadays, simply because there was less competition in the industry at that time. And in any given vertical now, it's like you were saying, when a VC sees like one type of company for a portfolio, other VCs will say, well, I need that type of company as well. There's an awareness, right, of like that these types of companies exist, and like copycats and competitors can spring up much more quickly rather than the 70s.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like, so one way to maybe think about this is like if we charted, like, let's say we set a valuation threshold. Let's say it's like 50 million.
Sure. Well, the kind of inflation as well, but okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because 50 million used to be like a pretty solid company.
Sure.
Today, if you saw a company for less than 100 million, you're like, this is fine. That's okay. And so let's say it's 100 million. And so I wonder if you were to chart the average age of a company founder that got to 100 million in valuation, let's say, and charted it from like the 1980s or 1970s to today.
Sure.
I wonder what that would look like. And I think the slope would be basically, like, I think my estimation is that that it's actually trending downwards, and that the slope is basically like the broad appetite of the investor class to invest in younger people. And so I don't know. And I also think that it's actually become a lot easier and less rigorous to start a company and to scale a company. I think it costs less to fail. These are like super broad statements, but I think it costs less to fail. I think it's cheaper to start a company than it ever was. And so I think you just have, right? You have people that may not, like, I don't know this young lady, and like she seems super sophisticated, and selling a company for 175 million, even if it's vaporware, is like a big deal. But I imagine, like, if she had a real job, like, for a couple of years, like, this wouldn't have happened.
Right. Like, hang on. Let me read some paragraphs for you from this honestly pretty great New York Times article.
It's like too easy, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, but hang on. So let me read this for you, because we're seeing Theranos kind of all over again on a much smaller scale, but like it's the same kind of bullshit, right?
Yeah.
So I'm quoting from a New York Times article that is titled "How Charlie Javis Got JP Morgan to Pay 175 million for ... what exactly?" And it's written by a guy called Ron Lieber. Generally fan of the guy's work, and this article is no different. Good stuff. So I quote, "All along, Ms. Javis was making frequent media appearances. In December 2017, she wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times with the headline, quote, 'The 8 most confusing things about FAFSA,' FAFSA being the federal student loan, right, stuff, paperwork stuff, okay, end quote. The piece contained so many errors that it required an 8-sentence correction." Correction there? 8-sentence correction? Jesus Christ. What? Okay, going on. Nevertheless, over the next 2 years, publications continued to shower praise on her. A Business Insider article from October 2018 that appeared on Yahoo Finance had a headline proclaiming, quote, "A 26-year-old founder has a solution to what Bill Gates calls a, quote, unnecessary roadblock, end quote, to college, and her startup is helping students get thousands off their tuition," end quote. Long fucking title for an article, right? But again, praise. And it's like, appeared on 2019 Forbes 30 under 30 finance list, Crane's New York Business 40 under 40 list. The Crane's article says Javis has done her homework. So, I mean, look, I think we live in this economy where we need headlines, and there is nothing better. I mean, again, right? Like, we talk about Gates and Jobs being these young dudes in their garages in Silicon Valley, in, the what decades was it? It was the 80s, right? I don't
It was
think it
the
was
80s,
the
I
70s. It was
think.
the 80s.
Yeah. 80s were wild years, apparently.
Yeah. I mean, I want to say it was late, but I think it was 80s. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, but like, so we love that story, right? We love the Steve Jobs book with his face on it. We were looking in many ways religiously for the next Messiah, right? And the media, right, for better or for worse, is in the business of selling ad clicks, right? And headlines get ad clicks, right? And that's kind of like what the economy looks like in many ways, right? I mean, the media is important, and there are good and important stories, investigative journalism, etc. I mean, right? But at the same time, that's not what pays the bills. What pays the
Right.
bills is look at this 26-year-old founder who, did this crazy thing, and it's awesome, and they're so young, and they're doing this amazing stuff. And I'm just like, even after in a post Theranos world, that is still a headline that gets clicks. I don't really blame the media. What is that a reflection of us as a society? Why are we so fascinated by this? Why do we think this is interesting? And why do we not immediately perk our like fox ears up and say like, hey, wait a second, I'm listening for the noise here because there seems to be something that I'm not hearing.
Dude, that's like such a great point. You know, what is it about us that we're attracted to that?
Yeah.
Like why do we care? I mean, that's why they're reporting on it. You know, and part of me is like,
yeah, because we'll click. Yeah.
Yeah, and part of me is like, I think you and I, we would have too much shame to do something like
100%.
that. Like ignore even the ethics. Like we would have too much shame to get in front of like the Times or whatever, the Wall Street Journal,
Yeah.
and like talk about something that we did not understand that well. We would just be like, I'm sorry, I don't know. Maybe that's our upbringing. I don't know what it is, but I'm just like, and so that's like what I.
Well,
like
upbringing is important, right? Because we were just talking about this offline, right, off the podcast, but one-to-one, our parents would scream at us for making mistakes, right?
100%.
Like, shaming you when you're wrong is a part and parcel of growing up with our South Asian background. So yeah, go on.
Yes, no, that's totally true, and I think that's healthy. Like there should be some healthy fear of failure and like of being wrong. Like you should want to be right and want to know what you're talking about. And so in some ways I can like almost like admire in a perverse way that like this person, I mean, I don't know anything about her, so let me keep it more general. That a lot of entrepreneurs.
Let me give you a fun factoid, right?
Yeah.
Part of the origin story, if you call this person a quote unquote like startup superhero, their origin story. Oh, they were at UPenn undergrad, and their mom was crying on the phone with the financial aid office, and that's what inspired her to be like, I want to make getting financial aid simpler for students or whatever. Meanwhile, then it also goes on to say that like she went to a private school in Westchester. And that her dad worked on Wall Street for 35 years, 11 years with Goldman Sachs, 3 years at Merrill Lynch, in a career spanning more than 35 years. How does this person get financial aid? Like, this is what makes fucking sense. That whole story just sounds like bullshit, and I don't even look at it that much, right? Like,
totally. And I think both of us would feel shame if we represented untruths in this manner.
Yeah.
But this is like, but I will meet people in our industry that are maybe starting businesses or somewhat farther along that present themselves like and their origin story in this kind of, let's say, I don't know, embellished manner, and the incentive structure supports it. Like the VCs are not doing background checks on you. I will confirm that.
Yeah, which is kind of crazy, but yes, also can confirm in my, experience.
Yes. Yeah. Totally. Having worked on venture deals, they're not doing background checks. They're not calling your parents. They're not calling your spouse.
Yeah.
Which they probably should, in some ways.
Maybe, yeah.
Like look up the parents on LinkedIn. I don't know. And so
I feel like, and so this goes back to what you're saying is like, look, right? Let's say I'm a person at, JPM's like M&A factory, or I'm, at a GP at a fund or whatever. And I'm like, okay. And let's say I'm looked to for like the deal flow that I can screen and bring in, and that's how like I make my claim to being worth my salary, right, or worth my distribution or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I screen Charlie Javis, and I'm like, okay, I might have some reservations, but overall, like, I have pressure to bring a good deal. I think whether or not I think this is a good deal and I would make this, credit with my own money, like, I'm willing to take this package to those behind me and say, this is a good deal. And I'm kind of a gambler here, right? And I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, maybe there's something wrong, but rather than look too hard, right? I just want to take this investment up the chain and see where it goes, because if Javis could sell me, maybe she could sell those guys, then they make an investment and then I get, whether it's a huge bonus or whether it's, a promotion or whatever the case may be. While initially I'm a screen, once you pass my screen, I become an internal advocate. And then you don't really, as the founder, have to worry quite so much, because, like, there is someone within the firm who has an incentive to sweep your bullshit under the rug,
Yes.
right?
There's a flywheel to not disconfirm their
Right.
initial read on you. Yeah.
Correct. Right. Now, look, if the penalty for bringing in a bad investment to a fund was to get shot, then, like, I think maybe you would see, right? But so that's not there. Like, and I don't know what is there, but maybe it's nothing. And maybe that's the
It's
problem.
nothing. I don't think it's anything.
And
I don't.
that's the problem, right?
Yeah.
Like Sequoia, after, grandstanding about SBF, nobody should ever want to do business with them again, I think, right? But that's not going to happen. They're going to be just fine.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So I didn't know this. So Sequoia was the first backer of FTX.
I don't know if the first backer, but they had, like, it's off their website now, but you can pull it up off the Wayback Machine. I linked to it in that huge trove of information I put together called the FTX files. On the Wayback Machine, you can find the link to, or a link to the Wayback Machine for the article that was previously on Sequoia's website. They took it down, but there's this archive of the internet called the Wayback Machine that, right, snapshots things. And it's like this, apparently, if you print it out, it's like 8 or 10 pages, like glowing review of SBF as this like guru, wonder kid, genius, brilliant, OMG, whatever, right? And mind you, look, I think his fraud was much more difficult to unravel than, like, in terms of ranking the frauds and how difficult they are to unravel. I think you've got SBF here at the top. You've got, like, Elizabeth Holmes Theranos here, and Charlie Javis at the way, 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 very bottom, right? Like, fake users. Are you fucking kidding me?
So totally. Like, yeah. It's I know. So, I was having this conversation
Like,
with
if
a
you had
buddy.
API access to the platform, I'm sure you could probably just figure out the fact that they were fake users, right? Like, I think
Yes.
that's all you need.
Yeah. Well, if you probably like did what they did, which is like try to send one marketing email, you could figure that out.
Yeah. Based on your clicks and things like that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, because so they were saying that like 300,000 or a million or something emails returned as like not functional.
25%.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, like literally all these users are bullshit. Like you just said, like if they had sent one marketing email or like announcing the acquisition of Frank, they would have fucking understood that, right?
Yeah. Jesus Christ.
Yeah. So I was having this conversation with a buddy of mine about FTX, and
Yeah.
the one thing that we thought about was like, okay, so FTX was like a legitimate business, right? Like they were providing customer value, they were an exchange, they had liquidity at one point, and like they were providing value to the market. Like the fraud there is that they over leveraged and that they were stealing money, right? But like the business itself, I don't know what the peak evaluation was for FTX. If it was like I'm probably off by an order of magnitude. Let's say it's like 20 billion. I don't know.
More than that, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah, 50 billion or 100, right?
So yeah, higher. Yeah.
It was probably like a $1 billion startup, maybe two, maybe five, even. Maybe it was in a half $1 billion company, which is like still like, that's impressive. That's a really valuable company. That's something to be proud of.
Like the hubris was in allowing your, like, so FTX was like, I don't want to get too far into this for
Yeah.
right, but like there's basically three companies: an international exchange, a U.S.
Yes.
based exchange,
Yes.
and this hedge fund, right,
Yeah.
Alameda, right.
Yeah.
So like, first of all, that should kind of perk your ears, right? Wait, you're running an exchange, but you're also running a fund that would trade on the exchange. That seems like a bit of a conflict. And then you
Yes.
allow the exchange, well, you allow the fund certain privileges on the exchange that you don't allow regular users, like, for instance, auto liquidation, right?
Yeah.
So if
Yeah.
I'm so out of the money, like, you can liquidate my collateral and, like, close out the position, right?
Yes.
That didn't apply to Alameda. And then Alameda was basically like being able to illegally borrow, right, customer funds and enter into an extremely high leverage on the platform. That's the nexus of where the fraud is. It's in allowing your hedge fund to do things on your exchange that you didn't allow other people to do, and
Totally.
also allowing your hedge fund to commit crimes, right, like stealing money.
Totally.
But yeah, I mean that's a complicated fraud that was built on the back of a company that may well. I mean, look, right. The other problems were like they had no internal controls. Like everything inside the company was just a mess, right? John Ray's statements on this are like pretty damning, and I don't think that the guy is like being hyperbolic in his, or too hyperbolic in his commentary, right?
Yeah.
I literally think they were running things on post-it notes. That I can tell, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I heard
I've
about.
done days, like multiple 24 hours worth of work looking at FTX.
Yeah.
So should an exchange be run on the back of post-it notes? No, right? But like absent the Alameda and all the other issues surrounding the criminal activities that happened there, could this have been a legitimate business? Kind of, yeah, but not for long. Also, I don't know what the other crypto exchanges are like what other platforms and how they do business. But like, I have worked inside like banks before, right? I know people who've worked at like the NYSE before, and it is extremely buttoned. Yeah, there are legacy technology issues to kind of loop back into a theme. That's what I love about like these discussions because they're so thematic. You can loop back, and we're talking about kind of the same stuff in a different flavor here. Look, yeah, there are sins of the past that are committed. Yeah, you have like banks that are running programs that are built off of other programs that run fucking COBOL. Fine, those sins exist, and those need to be cleaned up. But those sins are of like orders of magnitude less than trying to run an exchange on the back of post-it notes, which is basically what FTX was doing. Not actually, but like figuratively speaking, that's kind of what their level was, right?
Yeah.
So, like
Is it a crime to have a poorly run business?
in some instances, yes. So when you are custodying customer funds, I mean, again, right? So this
That's
is
fair.
so.
Yeah.
Is it a crime or is it a regulatory infraction? That's a
Yeah.
hair to split, right? Maybe it's not a crime, maybe it's just regulatory. And then you want to talk about the overly lax regulatory regime. Like, for instance, if we were to set up a commodities exchange and do it the way that FTX was running their business, oh, you can best believe that the CFTC would, come and rip our
Yeah.
fucking faces off, right? Like,
Yeah.
if it was a
Yeah.
securities exchange, both FINRA and the SEC would fucking not have it, right?
Yes.
The question is, do these like crypto guys and their little crypto exchanges fall under their jurisdiction? And that's a question that being a lawyer who does financial regulatory stuff, I'm not prepared to give my thoughts on it at this moment because like that's a deep question about which I hold myself to a higher standard of like, if I'm going to talk about that, I need to have spent 10 hours of research for every 5 minutes of talking that I do. And I haven't done that research yet. Not that there's like, you know, how to put this. It is less about looking at the laws that exist because they may not be good enough, but thinking about what the laws could be and should be, which I'm the kind of person who like could and would have an opinion on it were I able to find the time to do the homework, which I will hopefully, I don't know, a couple of weeks, I would say, right? It's something I would do want to talk about, but you know, I would want to be able to put forth like suggestions and ideas on how we might do this. And presently I'm not ready to do that.
Yeah. That's very fair. That's very unlike the Frank founder.
Well, that's the thing. It's like you got to know, like, well, here's the thing, right? Like, I'm not a 26-year-old wonder kid. I'm a soon to be 37-year-old lawyer who, like, I also respect the fact of where I went to school. Like, I went to two pretty great schools, and people generally believe that people who went to those schools are smart and, especially with law school, like responsible. And
You're right.
I would feel ashamed if I dragged Columbia Law School into the mud because of something stupid that I did, right? Like,
Right.
there's this level of like, I sit on the shoulders of giants who came before me, and my actions reflect upon theirs. I don't know where that doesn't come into play with these people, like, but it fucking didn't. And not that they went to slouch schools. They're Holmes, Stanford, SBF, MIT, Javis, UPenn. Those aren't slouches by
Right.
any means, right?
Right.
So like, yeah, I don't know, but I think it goes back to what you're saying. You're dead on. It's our upbringing, man. It's just like, okay, let's go to a fraud committed by somebody who isn't white Caucasian. George Santos, right?
Okay. You did this one.
Yeah, this one was. I'm looking at the Times article. That is, I mean, it's just one of however many. But I'm looking at the Times article that was in our kind of prep sheet for today. Quote, Santos's lies were well known to some well-connected Republicans. This is an article in the New York Times written by Nick Fandos. Again, great journalist, generally a fan of his work. And this article is no different than, in terms of quality, than what I'm used to from him in the Times. I mean, like, people should just read the litany of facts or non-facts surrounding George Santos, right?
Yeah,
Like,
it's a lot, dude.
It's a lot.
I mean, yes, it's a lot. And it seems like a psychological problem. Like, it doesn't seem like it's like a Republican Party. I mean, sorry.
No, yeah, I mean, I think this guy's got a special set of issues, right? But
Yeah.
the Republican Party, this is the problem, it did prop him up.
Yeah.
So what this article alleges, right, is that there are high-ranking people within the GOP who knew that this Santos guy was fugazi, but instead of being like, oh, well, we need to do the responsible thing and withdraw our candidate or maybe find a new candidate. And again, there's something interesting here about, like, at what point did they know, right? So, like, you know, was it at the very early stages? In which case, like, that's fucking stupid. Like, why would you go with this guy? Or was the conclusion somewhat foregone where, like, you know, was it after he'd actually won, or was he just so far along in the process? But, like, instead of pulling the horse, right, they ran the horse in the race, right, knowing it was running on a bed of lies, right? And so, like, yeah, I mean, this guy's a problem, but the bigger question is when people backing him realized that he was a problem, they didn't pull him. And this is the same thing we're talking about with, you know, Bankman-Fried, Charlie Javis, Elizabeth Holmes as well. It's like, what is the deal with propping up liars?
Yeah, it's true. I think today there's almost, how should I say, there's not enough cost to doing business with liars because people forget. Like, you know, we think about Bernie Madoff. He was head of NASDAQ, right? I mean, similar to SBF in some ways, right? He ran an exchange. He also had a Ponzi scheme.
Wait, was it an exchange? No, Madoff was a investment firm.
But I think he was head of NASDAQ, or
Was
he
he?
was head of he was head of NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. One of those. Let's see.
Googling. He was at one time chairman of NASDAQ. You're right.
Yes. So he ran a fucking exchange.
Yeah.
And then, like, think about that. That's scary, right?
Yeah.
Just like, right, he's supposed to be a neutral party facilitating free commerce. Head of a marketplace, if you will. And, right? So I think, like, in this instance, you know, it's tricky. I wonder if the Republican Party makes, like, really, like, too many concessions to, like, the moral failings of its candidates because, like, they're confused about why they exist.
I mean, here's something that's completely feckless, right? So Santos is running against Tom Suozzi. Suozzi is, like, a well-known, and mind you, like, to disclaim this, right, like, I actually don't know if so Teja, you and I grew up, you know, for a long time, me for the entirety of my high school career in Port Washington, which is in Nassau County, New York. Which I don't know if Port Washington falls within Santos's district, but it well may. I can Google that and find out. But in any case, we're from Nassau County, New York, where all this is kind of, like, rooted in. And Tom Swazi was like a pretty like we both knew his name like growing up in middle school and high school here.
Yeah.
Legit player, right? And so he was the incumbent running against Santos. And here's the quote from the Times article. In 2020, the party incumbent Tom Swazi dismissed Mr. Santos as a non-viable threat and conducted no opposition research at all while cruising to victory. When Democrats did vet him 2 years later, they failed to find some of the most egregious fabrications that prompted members of Mr. Santos's campaign team to quit. Like, what? Because, okay, we don't live in a dictatorship, right? It's not as though we're in like, Russia where it's like, oh, here's Putin. Okay, nobody can question Putin. Here we are. No, like this is a democracy. And where was his opposition finding these like, factoids and putting them into the public discourse? That didn't happen either. Apparently because I didn't even think it was worth doing.
This dude said he had grandparents who died in the Holocaust, which is apparently patently untrue.
Yeah, which is also like a crazy thing to say in Nassau County because we
100%.
have an extremely large Jewish community here, many of whom, of our age have grandparents who, were in the Holocaust, right? Whether they survived or were killed. That's a powerful thing, but also if it's a lie, a crazy lie to make, when you're in Nassau County or trying to represent Nassau County. And the same thing is, how did this not, how did this get missed here?
Exactly.
Like the only crazier place to lie about that is Israel, right? Like,
yeah, that's true. It's either like Nassau County or like Long Island, I should say.
It really is Nassau, but yeah.
And
like North Shore of Nassau, but
that's true.
This is a crazy place to say something like that. But then it's completely feckless, right? It's completely stupid if you're the opposition to not have picked up on that and use it to your advantage. I mean, we do work in a like combative adversarial like voting process, right? And it's incumbent upon the opposition of any individual candidate to like point out their flaws. And if you like don't do that because you think they're just not worth pointing out the flaws of, right? Like you think they're just not really a threat, you're doing not only yourself, but you're doing your constituents a disservice because there's maybe people in the GOP in Nassau County who wouldn't want this guy, but you need to inform them that, hey, that dude's not a good choice, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't considered that. It's true.
Yeah, I mean,
and not doing opposition research in some ways are abdicating their civic duty, especially when it's like this.
When it's like this, yeah. I mean, look, right? If you're like, I don't know, hiring like a private investigator to find out if someone's cheating on their wife, like I don't really give a shit about that as much, right? When you're trying to find out whether like, this guy actually had grandparents that died in the Holocaust, or like did or did not run a Ponzi scheme, like I do kind of care about those lies, right? Not to say that like the more sundry lies are like less bad, but like they kind of are compared to fraud.
Yeah. Not on a large scale. Apparently this dude scammed like a homeless dude.
Did you see the one about the dog? He scammed a dog that had cancer or something. It's just like it doesn't.
It's insane. It's insane. I mean, there's something wrong, I think, when our political system seems to attract the most sociopathic of our population.
Yeah. There's this quote, right? There's this quote that exists, and I don't know who says it. I'm sure you can Google it. Those who want power the most are those who are least qualified to have it.
Something like totally that, true.
Right?
Yeah.
And
totally.
Like that's kind of where we're at. And I don't know if that's entirely just politics, right? It's like those who crave $100 million valuation over anything else are those least entitled to have one.
100%.
I would say that's also probably true. Right?
That's also true. Yeah. That's also true. Yeah.
Like focus on building a real company and don't worry about like what the market values you at before you're really ready to like put a foot down. And all these people were just like, nope, time to do frauds.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is fraud in a way to misrepresent yourself to the public. Is that like a chargeable offense? Like if this person were to lie about who they are or like where they went to school, can you actually be sued for that as a politician?
So that's super interesting. So like Okay. Because so now we have like several qualifications on that, right? So like,
Yeah. Yeah. Politician and yeah.
yeah, if you are like running for office based on lies, federal electoral law is its own body of law. I am a less than zero in terms of my knowledge of it. DC is one of those things that just like scares me so much I avoid it because of all of like, you know, Santos is just like the worst Apple example, but like, yeah, I mean, I try to avoid the intersection of law and politics in that way as much as possible. So I don't know what is or is not an FEC violation. Most of what I do know deals with campaign finance laws and lobbying, right? Because like, so one of the things that I do like have to work on from time to time is like if clients want to lobby governments for change, right, or government agencies, whatever. So that bit I do know a bit about, but like in terms of like what you can and cannot do as a candidate, I don't know. Criminally speaking, like telling a lie is not a crime, right? Unless you like use that lie to like, for instance, take money from people. And typically that comes up in a securities context. Lying to get some kind of value from people out of it, you can generally find a way to do something about it, whether civilly or criminally. And from a large like perspective, on a broad stroke perspective, we can call that like fraud. But with the criminal law, you have to be very, very specific, right? Because you have to point to a criminal statute that like makes this conduct illegal. Civilly, right? I mean, you have much more bandwidth, some breadth, let's say, to determine the cause of action, and with specificity with regards to a political candidate. You'd have to look at like the laws around that, which I know less than zero about. But yeah, no, I mean, because we're trying to figure out now what to do with Santos is like, can you actually pull him out of office? Like, do we have to wait to do anything about this, or can we do something now? And whether the consent of the GOP would be required in order to do something like that, like votes in the House, etc., right, to expel him. I mean, he got committee assignments, so like, it's not really looking like that he's going to go anywhere anytime soon. Although,
Yeah.
who's to say? I don't know. I hope he does, but
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I wonder if there was a penalty for misrepresentation or for lying as a politician, would that clean shit up a little bit? You could ask really powerful answers that you had to answer truthfully. Who knows?
If we're trying to solve the problem of politicians making like false representations, I mean, that's a problem as old as politics itself, right? So like, you and me on this podcast are not going to solve that one.
It'll take at least a couple podcasts for us.
Yeah, 2 or 3 episodes. I think we'll probably. So I've been kind of leading the go through on this prep sheet we have, but let me turn it over to you. What do you want to talk about?
Honestly, I feel like that's a solid first episode.
Yeah, I think we put together a solid first episode. Let's give ourselves a round of applause for that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the themes were sort of fraud
Fraud.
in all its forms.
Why
And it's
why the market loves fraudsters.
yes. Yeah,
That's another one.
yes.
And
I would say like adjacent to that, because fraud in a way is failing to honor a commitment. That's at least how I look at it, right? Either implicit or explicit.
right.
And
So that
so
can also mean like, making a misrepresentation, right? If your commitment is
yeah,
to like be the thing that you by definition are not upholding that commitment. Okay, I can kind of see that. Yeah. All right.
yeah. And I mean, adjacent to that is sort of like the implicit commitment we expect on the other side of engaging with technology, that it works, that it's the information that we share with it is safe,
Yeah.
that it's reliable,
Yeah.
that there's high uptime. So I think we covered that pretty well.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you could argue that the FAA makes a continuum representation to the United States public, or the public traveling within the United States as airspace, that flights will take off and land.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we pay $1 in taxes, that is in some ways what we expect.
Right, right. And I think we can reasonably expect that, right? I mean, look, there's non-U.S. taxpayers who fly through the U.S. all the time, right? And so they have, I guess, a right to that as well. Maybe not. It's an interesting question of standing, but ultimately, I think if we can decide upon a theme of, through the noise of what we kind of went through today, it's that there needs to be some level of responsibility in doing the boring, unsexy homework, right? And whether that's due diligence on a company and its founder, or a political candidate, or even going through the value stack or tech stack of the technology that runs our world and determining points of failure and seeking to ameliorate those things as opposed to focusing on the new shiny hot thing. I think thematically what we're looking for here is a world in which people are eager to do the boring shit. And that's maybe at odds with human psychology, but nevertheless, it's what bears repeating, right? Over and over and over again. I don't care about the new football stadium. I care that this 30-year-old piece of technology gets fixed tomorrow, right? I don't care that Frank has allegedly 4 million users. I care about whether it actually does or does not, right? I don't care about whether Charlie Javis is this wonder kid. I care about whether the users are real. I don't care about whether polls say that this candidate Santos would win or not win. I care about whether this candidate Santos is or is not who he says he is, right? But instead of doing the dirty work, and again, like investigative journalists are really maybe the only ones kind of doing this, and there's only so many of them. Instead, the masses are just kind of focused on the shiny new thing, and some segments of the media, the revenue generating elements of the media that generate clicks and ad clicks and whatnot, are the ones focused on feeding us the shiny shit and don't make a dime off of doing the hard work. And I don't think that ever changes, which is the sad part.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, the news media makes their dime off of us not doing that work because it's a salacious headline when we don't.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. The FAA thing. I mean, yeah, like FTX failing did probably a nice bucket or two of cash for the media, right? For CoinDesk, it probably did best in their quarter, best quarter in their year. Yeah.
FAA does its job.
No headline. No one's clicking that. Yeah. Flight took off and landed today. CNN, no hits, right? Yeah, look. Yeah, I don't know. I think we leave that there. I mean, like, there's nothing more to say, right? It's just a dark truth about humanity that, like, we love gawking at a controversy, and so we are incentivized to allow the underlying system conditions to exist such that controversies do arise. Yeah, fuck.
That's right.
Oh, fuck. All right. Awesome. Well,
till next time.
Yeah, until next time.
It's a good spot to leave it.
Good luck out there, everyone. We'll see you later. The Noisecutter podcast is a production of Titan Gray, LLC, and is hosted by me, Rex Chatterjee. If you found our podcast helpful and want to say thanks, please head over to your favorite podcast app, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever else, and give us a review, leave a comment, and hit that follow or subscribe button to stay up to date on the latest. For more about our guest or this episode, head over to our website, noisecutterpodcast.com, where you'll find contact info for our guest as well as links to some of the things we talked about on this episode. If you want to reach us directly, just send an email to info@noisecutterpodcast.com. This recording is a copyright of Titan Gray, LLC, with all rights reserved. This podcast may be construed as attorney advertising, and prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. Nothing in this podcast should be construed as legal advice, and your listening to this podcast or contacting us about it does not form an attorney-client relationship. No affiliation or relationship, including an attorney-client relationship, exists between us and our guests unless otherwise stated. For full terms of use, please visit our website at noisecutterpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time, here at Noisecutter.